All right, welcome everybody. Really glad to have you here. This is Arthur from ECR. Want to welcome you all to today's event, Hope Without Hope, with our dear friend Matt Broomfield, whose work many of you are probably already familiar with. We're very excited to have you all. It's kind of our special end of the year event. So the main feature of the event is going to be a talk from Matt about his book. We're going to be opening up a group conversation. And we also have a few announcements and updates about the emergency committee for Rojava as we kind of get ready to round out the year. One quick thing is that we will be recording today's event. So if you have to hop off early, or if you know other folks who were interested but unable to make it during the busyness of the holidays, for example, be sure to check out our YouTube channel where we'll be posting this soon, maybe tonight or tomorrow. Um, I think it's a good idea to first kind of ground us in this moment before we pass things off to Matt. I'm sure he'll mention, but this is a time where Syria is very much in, at the crossroads. The future of the country is uncertain. The future of the revolution in Rojava and, the diverse communities, not just Kurdish communities, but Armenian communities, Assyrian communities, and others, who have really been, building and defending society based on principles of self-governance, self-defense, cultural pluralism and cooperation. Many of us have come to this event and this project and this work out of a sense of inspiration from the revolution in Rojava. So at the top of our minds these days is the question of what's going to happen. But I think it is easy to get sort of carried away with the constantly changing news and fears, concerns about the future. But it's also important to kind of take a deeper reflection about the real significance of this project, of the revolution in Rojava, of the broader Kurdish freedom movement, uh, where it comes from. And I think that Matt's book does an amazing job. Matt's book is called Hope Without Hope, Rojava and Revolutionary Commitment. It does an incredible job of really sort of reflecting on the lessons of this incredible revolutionary movement for movements elsewhere, talking about this question of hope in seemingly hopeless times, right? So we're going to spend today's event mostly talking about that, talking about these kind of broader themes, letting us take a sense of inspiration, let us reflect on these broader questions. But we do just want to do that to kind of ground us in this moment, to give just a quick overview of where we are, where things are on the ground in Northeast Syria these days. As many of you have heard, there's a new regime in Damascus. There's a process of peace negotiations taking place between the autonomous administration and the Syrian Democratic Forces and this new regime in Damascus, headed by al-Jilani, or also known as al-Shara. There's also a parallel peace process unfolding in North Kurdistan in Bakur, or Turkey, between Abdullah Öcalan and the Kurdistan Workers' Party on the one hand, and the Turkish state on the other hand. And, really, this is a whole process. It's all tied together. The consequences of each are really inseparable. But it's a time where there's not just fear and concern, there also is a real sense of hope, of cautious optimism that there could be an alternative to continuing war, that there could be political solutions to the region's conflicts, which could result in some kind of formal recognition or at least de facto security of this situation of self-governance, of self-determination on the ground in northeast Syria, and hopefully political cultural rights being further secured for Kurdish communities north of the border as well. Um, I think also to kind of ground us in this moment, right? We're seeing a global rise of authoritarianism in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. So I think the kind of bridge from the constantly changing news on the ground and the sense of urgency we feel to these sort of broader themes of today's event, I think we could think about this theme of authoritarianism and the dire need to find a practical alternative to this sort of dominating state mentality, the exploitative mentality of capitalism, not sort of forms of social domination, whether we're talking about racism and patriarchy. And the Kurdish freedom movement can really be a window into thinking about alternative ideas and practices to these systems that are sort of dragging us down with them. Um, Before we move on to Matt's talk, I do want to mention that the big update from ECR today is that we have finally launched our end of year fundraiser. So if you follow the links in the chat, you can see your way to our website and we are basically trying our best to raise $10,000 by the end of the year. And this is just to help us continue to do the work of raising awareness and support for Rojava and the Kurdish freedom movement, to continue doing sort of the grassroots popular education and advocacy that we do here in the United States to try to build sort of internationalist solidarity with that movement. We do have some exciting gifts this year for our donors, including a variety of books, and even some homemade t-shirts. And the thing I want to mention at the top of it is that Matt's new book, Hope Without Hope, is going to be one of our featured donor gifts. So if you don't have a copy yet yourself, or if you are already such a fan of the book that you want to recommend it to your friends and comrades and family, we encourage you to check out our fundraiser. It's a great way to, contribute to building this internationalist movement of solidarity and also getting a great book at the same time. So please do check that out. Um, Without further ado, I think it's a great time to go ahead and give an overview of the event. So we're going to hear Matt's talk. We will have the chance to ask some questions. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat while Matt's speaking. We'll do our best to kind of collect those and get to as many of them as we can. And then we will be just sharing some more updates at the end while we wrap up. So pretty straightforward event today. Um, Without further ado, let's go ahead and introduce Matt. Matt, we really appreciate having you here today. Many of us have been following your work for some years, and we know it's you're having to deal with electricity issues and Wi-Fi where you are. So we doubly appreciate you finding a way to make it work. So thank you for
My
being here.
pleasure. Yeah, I don't know what is it. Is it de rigueur to say happy holidays? I don't know how you do it over there, but yeah, happy holidays
Yeah,
to
you could say
everyone.
happy holidays
And yeah,
for sure.
I hope you can hear me.
We can, and thank you. Um, Okay, here we are. So many of you not only have probably heard of Matt's work if you're following the Rojava Revolution, but also I bet there's a decent chance many of you heard about the Rojava Revolution through Matt's work, through work that Matt helped make possible. Matt, of course, being a co-founder of the Rojava Information Center, as well as a journalist and writer in his own right. I want to take a moment just to read Matt's proper biography briefly because it deserves mentioning. Matt Broomfield is a British journalist, poet, and organizer. From 2018 to 2020, he spent 3 years living and working in Rojava, North and East Syria, where he co-founded the Rojava Information Center, the top independent English language news source connecting the Kurdish-led autonomous regions with the international press. His writing has appeared in The Independent, New Statesman, Vice, The Nation, and Jacobin, among others. Matt, we really appreciate having you here again, as we said. Please go ahead and maybe give us a general overview of your work, the topics touched in this new book of yours, which is, as I said, really incredible. And then we'll kind of work towards opening up the conversation a little bit. Yes, you've got a copy. Show us the beautiful cover.
Of course. Yeah. So yeah, here is the book. Hope Without Hope. Rojava and Revolutionary Commitment. So yeah. First of all, thanks to all of you for coming. It's yeah. as a non-North American. It had not occurred to me that this was the holiday season, to be quite honest. But yeah, I'm really glad that you're here, and yeah, I think hopefully we can have a conversation about some of the themes in the book and possibly also their relevance to what's happening in the United States at the present moment. And I'd be very interested to hear people's reflections on that as well. So yeah, first, thanks to Arthur for the introduction, and thanks to ECR for setting up the event. And yeah, I agree, of course. This book will be a great stocking filler. But in general, you should go ahead and of course support the fundraiser. What I'm going to do now is speak for I guess like 10 minutes, just to give you a context of where does this book come from, why did I want to write this book, and you mentioned the idea of lessons coming from Rojava for people involved in political work in different ways in the West. So I'll speak a bit about that, and I'll then read a sort of 10-minute, basically a sort of shortened version of the introduction of the book to give a sort of flavor of it, and then we can go ahead to have a bit of a discussion. This book, comes, as Arthur said, was written, or the ideas for it developed during the 3 years that I spent living and working in Rojava. And I guess it's sort of, in a way, it's a response to the kind of the questions that I traveled to Rojava with in the first place, as I reflected on them, as I lived there, worked there, as I got to know the revolution, to understand it better, to speak with a lot of people living there in the region. I think there were two reasons why I went there in the beginning. The first, I suppose, was more political, more organizational, and the second was more psychological, more emotive, maybe. And those are the two sort of themes that intertwine throughout this book. So, I mean, on the first hand, there was, I think, a push factor and a pull factor. And the pull factor was, I was fascinated by the idea of this political model that was developing there, and I wanted to understand it more. And what I particularly wanted to understand organizationally was, how does it fit together that, there are, on the one hand, what people here are familiar with, perhaps what the revolution is most known for, this commitment to sort of grassroots politics, bottom-up politics, direct democracy, minority autonomy, women's autonomy, the principles that, we're probably familiar with in Rojava and perhaps familiar with in other organizing spaces in the West. You have that, but then on the other hand, this is not just, a sort of squat or, sort of a small kind of, sort of project experiment, as it sometimes tend to happen in the middle of nowhere. This is a society, you're talking about millions of people. You're talking about, one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. You're talking about one of the worst wars of the 21st century so far. And then you're also speaking about, in that context, a movement which, has a deep organizational culture, which, as people know, the movement which inspired the Rojava Revolution is the PKK, which historically has been, top down, sort of militant organization, organized in a very different way, perhaps, to how we're accustomed to organize in the West. So I wanted to understand how those two ideas fit together, and that was sort of the pull factor, that desire to understand and to learn from that model to get to know it better. But there was also a push factor. And I think that push factor was quite simply that I was tired of losing all the time. I was involved in different forms of political organization, in Europe and in the UK. But it's just hard, it's difficult, as I'm sure everyone here knows. And, perhaps even more so now than it was 10 years ago. The left is on the back foot. The sort of authoritarian, state-led, neoliberal model that you guys offer us such a wonderful example of in America is, of course, being exported and replicated worldwide. And on my experience, I suppose, on the left was, that we were always on the back foot. We were losing. We were firefighting. We could do things. We could organize. We had achievements, but it was always kind of, okay, we've managed to prevent this bad thing from happening. Maybe we could pause this policy that was going to be passed. Maybe we could help these people who were suffering and alleviate their suffering somehow. We could create an alternative here. But it was always this, we weren't able, it's difficult for us to dream of an alternative, to build something. And that was, I found that hard, as many of us do. And that was also why I wanted to go there. The appeal, of course, of this, this revolution that was a revolution and that achieved, something on this scale, was a great draw. And I wanted to sort of feel that and to understand, what does that feel like to be in that kind of space. And so, those were the questions that I went to Syria with, and I spent, a little under three years there. And I suppose, yeah, as I sort of discussed in the book, I got to learn that the answers to these two questions were kind of intertwined. Um, I mean, I think yes, I sort of sort of at the outset of that, I would say originally this book was called Hope Without Hope, like Lessons from Rojava, but we scrapped that title, and also kind of the direction of the book somewhat changed because I think it's not so simple as to say, this is what they're doing in Rojava is good, and what we are doing in the West is bad and not working, for example. And there are issues and challenges, contradictions in Syria, and there are great things happening, all across the world as well. And it's not that people in Rojava are just hopeful and happy and everything's great and we're all just doomed to despair and defeat. It's of course more complicated than that. And so I approach instead, through this idea of hope without hope. And the question that I ask in the book is, how come in the middle of this hopeless situation, this seemingly catastrophic situation, this movement was able to have this vision and to put it into practice? And where else has that happened throughout history? Where else has it been that in hopeless circumstances, hope has come forth? And where can we find that, as we look around us? How can we access some of those things that are perhaps more obvious in Rojava? How can we recognize them in our own organizing? How can we strengthen them? How can we strengthen them in our own networks, and so on? And so the answers to that, took, sort of I address throughout the book. And on the one hand, I believe those answers are organizational, that I think the movement sort of, as I discuss at length in the book, has the confidence to have a sort of this sort of internal organizational structure which respects a lot of these things that are less fashionable in the West, perhaps, or less in practice in our political circles, that respects discipline, that respects structure, that respects long-term work, has a commitment to long-term work rooted in local communities, has a commitment to flexibility, to pragmatism, in pursuit of this very utopian goal. And it's somehow there's an interesting tension that I found very often there. That's the fact of having this utopian vision of what people want to build, that then enables them to justify the more mundane, the more grueling, the more pragmatic, for example, in their day-to-day interactions, in the politics that they're engaged in terms of how they relate to the communities around them. And so I speak about that kind of organizational model, how I see that working, and I think the idea that if you that sort of a politics which is organized, which is mass in character, which has a long-term goal, is a politics which can enable people not to despair, which justifies people's sacrifices, which enables people to say, okay, like this is going hard for me now, but I can see there's this bigger project which is taking part, which I'm just a small part of, and that is something which is helpful for people. And I, in the book, in various ways, I speak about that through history, how has that worked, and I speak about a little bit about how might that work, in some of the struggles that we're engaged in now, and what are the similarities, what are the differences between what's happening in North and East Syria and what's happening in the West. But more than that, ultimately in the book, I argue that sort of the real lessons from Rojava are not solely organizational so much as psychological, that there is sort of a spirit of revolutionary commitment, as I discuss as I'm saying, the subtitle of the book, which is linked to that, and which is as I said, this kind of ability to make what I discuss as a leap of faith, that people are committed to this project because it's something bigger than themselves, that they are committed to it because of the trust they have in those around them. And I speak a lot about that culture of comradeship. How is that built up? They're committed to it because I think also of the way that they relate to sacrifice, to hardship, and to death. And I speak about that, in the book as well. How does this movement, understand the terrible sacrifices and the losses it's gone through, and repeatedly throughout its history, how has this movement responded to defeats and setbacks on the organizational level, on the personal level, to personal loss, by making a renewed commitment, not by despairing, not by breaking apart, not by falling apart into infighting, although of course those things have happened, but by picking themselves up and using that crisis, that break, as a chance to leap forward. And so sort of through the book, I tell the evolution of the Kurdish movement, as the sort of history of learning from defeat, of responding to despair with hope, and of taking what I call this revolutionary leap forward. And so I speak about that in terms of how this movement developed, how they responded to the defeats of the defeats that was faced by the Socialist Project in the 90s, by the State Socialist Project in the 90s, and by themselves by coming up with this new political paradigm of Abdullah Öcalan. I speak then about how in the Syrian context they reacted to the Syrian crisis, not by, I suppose, sort of despairing, but by saying, okay, we're going to learn from the realities of what we have to do to survive here and use that to inform our political activity. And now, we're sort of now at this point, as Arthur said, where the movement again faces a crisis that can also be an opportunity. The situation in Syria is complex, and if we want to be, maybe we can speak about that more in the question and answer. I saw Sinam from the Syrian Democratic Council in Washington is also here with us, so maybe she will also be able to share her thoughts. The situation now in Syria, it's of course a great thing that Bashar al-Assad has fallen. There's a man who has taken more lives than anyone else in the Syrian conflict, and all Syrians, I'm sure, are happy to see him go. But again, the situation comes with challenges, particularly facing this project in the northeast, both direct military threats, but also political pressure to bow down once more, and more pressure to integrate, to give up on some of these ideals, to bow down to directives from Damascus or indeed from Washington. And the question, of course, now before this movement is, can they react to that? Can they go forward? Can they find a way to preserve what's so important in the northeast? In the face of this latest crisis, and that's the process, which is difficult, which is challenging, and which is unfolding now. But we can speak about that more, in the questions and answers. I'll read now a short extract, which, as I said, hopefully gives an overview of some of the key themes in the book, and I suppose how it tries to think about this revolution and what it might mean to us, and we can then open up for conversations and questions. On the eve of battle against Turkey, Kurdish fighters gather round a smartphone, tarnished AK-47s slung over skinny shoulders. These men aren't supposed to own phones, but they all have contraband Alcatels anyway, using them mostly to fill the long, dull interludes between combat by playing combat games. The clip they are watching is popular here in Rojava, or Syrian Kurdistan. In a scene from the blood-spattered blockbuster 300, we witness the run-up to the Spartan resistance against the Persian invasion at Thermopylae. Spartan warriors beat swords on shields, preparing for certain death. The Kurdish militants likewise stamp their feet on the earth behind the burn and chant, wordlessly, in unison. Within a week, I think to myself, some of these men will be dead. In the film, as in the legend, the Spartans are also subsequently slaughtered. But no matter. There's a perverse optimism to the way in which dubbed Hollywood clips circulate through Syrian Kurdish WhatsApp groups, wrenched out of context and deployed in support of whatever political, military, or perhaps more often romantic ideal the viewer has in mind. More generally, it's little wonder the region's Kurdish-led revolutionary forces feel an affinity with the embattled Spartans. In the face of crises set to define the coming century, their movement has produced an unexpected and utopian response, striving to implement a unique form of direct democratic, women-led, multi-ethnic governance. Yet even after liberating millions of Syrians from the brutal misogynist rule of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIS, they must battle repeated Turkish military operations aimed at extinguishing these fragile victories. Turkey has the American warplanes, the German tanks, the second largest army in NATO, proxy militias packed with former ISIS fighters. The Kurdish revolutionaries have little save their rusty AK-47s and a handful of bleak myths, into which they read calls for hope. These militants follow the intellectual and philosophical lead of jailed Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan and his Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. In theory and practice, in extremis and in their unexpected revolutionary triumph, the broader cluster of parties, armed groups and civil society organizations inspired by Öcalan's PKK and collectively known as the Kurdish Freedom Movement has proven itself capable of finding, maintaining and organizing hope throughout political crisis and social catastrophe. It was in response to historic defeats suffered by the PKK during the broader post-1989 collapse of state socialism that Öcalan initially developed his bold political program of grassroots democracy, women's autonomy and minority rights. Similarly, it was the catastrophe of the Syrian civil war, beginning in 2011, that enabled his movement to put this program into practice, following the outbreak of what is now known as the Rojava Revolution in 2012. In the course of this revolution, Kurdish militants have battled not only drone strikes and ethnic cleansing, but also similar challenges to those faced by many of us on the global left each day: pessimism, despair, suicide. Yet the existential nature of this struggle, the repeated losses and terrible sacrifices, enabled the Kurdish movement to unite 4 million Kurds, Arabs, and ethnic minority Christians and Yazidis. By answering defeat with a revolutionary faith in transformation, the Kurdish movement and its foot soldiers placed themselves in a particular tradition of anti-fascist and anti-colonial resistance, absurdist philosophy, and radical thought. This current of hope without hope flows unseen throughout millennia to explode into the world as revolutionary fervour bound up with madness, self-delusion, and self-sacrifice, as dogged resistance in the face of colonial violence and omnipotent, omnipresent, state-backed neoliberal hegemony, as the mystic utopian socialist horizon that has long justified the most grueling, mundane political organisation. Though it sometimes seems otherwise, this strange backward hope hasn't been extinguished by the dead weight of late capitalist hegemony. During 3 years living and working in Rojava, I found this spirit alive and well, surviving thousands of years after the defeat at Thermopylae on that smartphone screen cracked like a fallen Spartan shield. And we may also follow this current down to our own diverse struggles, communities, and movements, equipping us to shoulder our own revolutionary tasks in a similar spirit of grim defiance. The Syrian civil war, it's become increasingly clear, is this century's equivalent of the Spanish Civil War. It has prefigured an emergent and still poorly understood global conflict, just as that struggle between ascendant fascist forces and a doomed yet courageous socialist opposition prefigured the slaughter of World War II. The common confrontation, which Öcalan has long described as World War III, is set to be defined by factors that already mark the Syrian conflict, namely proxy warfare, resource competition, state collapse, mass displacement, political shockwaves emanating from the Middle East to shake the centres of imperial power, the potential disintegration of the so-called rules-based international order, Islamist or right nationalist, or even Christian nationalist militancy as the main vector of resistance to the authoritarian state, the simultaneous statist exploitation of these reactionary forces, all of it precipitated by rising temperatures, desertification, failed harvests, and the weaponization of water resources. But no internationalist movement has yet emerged to respond to our era of pandemics, climate catastrophe, and resurgent state conflict. Rather, as a wave of recent theorists have argued, the Arab Spring, subsequent pan-continental protest movements, and the brief flourishing of social democratic left populism have all been undone by organisational and strategic shortcomings. Throughout what has been called the past decade of the missing revolutions, a repoliticised spirit of often reckless resistance and desire for revolutionary change has not been organised into significant material victories. Millions have squandered their own hopeless hope at the ballot box, particularly in the Anglosphere and Western Europe, on barricades, particularly in South America and East Asia, or under a hail of bullets, particularly in the Middle East. 3 decades ago, many on the left hoped the collapse of the Soviet Union would clear the way for new, networked, horizontalist modes of political organisation, capable of mounting an effective challenge to seemingly triumphant neoliberal capitalism. That hasn't happened. Neither anarchists, social democrats, communists, nor emergent networks of feminist or indigenous organisation have ultimately proven able to do this resurgent spirit of revolutionary commitment justice by shaking it into a force capable of shaking those centres of imperial power. On the contrary, as Israel's genocidal 2023 war in Gaza has painfully shown, the world waits in vain for a resurgent militant internationalism genuinely capable of resisting authoritarian state violence in the Middle East and worldwide. No wonder so many of us feel defeated. And yet we continue to struggle for a better world, even a world we cannot quite believe in. How do we do it? How is it that we strive longer, harder, and more boldly than those liberal progressives who might claim to hold more optimistic outlooks for the future? How is it that the hopeless still hopes? For if the Kurdish movement does offer a superlative example of revolutionary commitment in hopeless circumstances, the same spirit also animates 1,000 smaller struggles worldwide. Each day, admittedly weak and localized forces still sometimes find the courage to withstand hegemonic capitalist powers they stand virtually no chance of overthrowing. If there's no point in deceiving ourselves over the limited nature of our victories, therefore, nor is there any point in wallowing in an equally stultifying defeatism. The Kurdish movement continues to reckon with its own defeats as part of complex strategic efforts to build up its radical alternative, learning from both the fatal internal contradictions of top-down state socialism and the proven organisational weakness of bottom-up anarchist organisation. The question is, can our movements do the same, deriving further lessons from the Kurdish movement's own historic defeats, battlefield triumphs, and ongoing struggles? So that is the question with which I begin the book. Yeah, we can go now, to a discussion if people have questions, contributions, either about some of these themes in the book on the more psychological side, the more organizational side, also of course about what's happening in the region. I'm very happy to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. I think much of what you're reading comes from the introduction to the book. Do I have that right? It's a
That's right.
really,
Yeah.
really fantastic piece that I think stands on its own and encourage people to pick up the book if for no other reason for that for that introduction. It serves as a great conversation starter in a study group as well. Before we kind of pass off to audience questions, I want to sort of abuse my authority as facilitator and ask you a couple follow-up questions myself. In your book, you touch on one of the sort of shortcomings of our movements that you mention ties back to the way that we perceive movements like Rojava and the Zapatistas as well. You talk about this sort of romanticization. And I'm wondering how you see these sort of misunderstandings as being tied to our own shortcomings. Put another way,
Mm,
what do you think people most misunderstand about the revolution in Rojava, and what are the ways that you see those misunderstandings, even positive forms, right? Like romanticizing it, thinking that everything is a utopia in Northeast Syria.
mm,
How do those misunderstandings actually weaken our ability to,
mm.
to make things possible as a movement?
Sure. I mean, I think so. I mean, actually, one of the things I say in the book is that there is a place for romanticization. And I suppose sort of what I mean by that's maybe a slightly a provocative way to put it, but I suppose what I mean by that is I think there is something which can be gained from this sort of internationalist commitment, into Rojava, for example, also into other movements worldwide, into the Palestinian movement, for example, that there's something, I think, perhaps what people identify in them and something that I felt, I suppose, when I became interested in this movement, that there's, I suppose, a dignity, seriousness that I felt was something that I was often lacking in organising that I was involved in. That I suppose it was apparent, sort of because of the sort of the gravity of the sacrifices that were being made there, because of the seriousness of the situation. That this was, it's a serious struggle. It's cost people are giving their lives to it. There is something there, and I think that then that's something, sort of, I think the relationship between like our movements in the West and movements elsewhere in the world, it should always be a two-way street. And I think, that's actually somehow that's part of what those movements can give is, when you stand in solidarity with the Kurdish movement, for example, with the Palestinian movement, for example, it's not just about you're supporting them. You'll get of course, we hope to learn from them, to learn from one another. And I think one of those first things is this sort of the fact that it's a revolution, it's something serious, it's something grand, or almost, and that's maybe particularly in the case of Rojava, that because it's something that's built, it's something positive. It's not just about the defiance, it's not just about the nobility of it or the struggle, the sacrifice. It's also about the fact of having built something. But then I think, as of course, sort of the main thrust really in the book is that perhaps sort of only goes so far, and that sort of once one if one has the opportunity to travel there, there to Rojava, to northeast Syria, you very quickly are disabused, I think, of the notion that this is in any way, if that was a sort of a thought that you arrived at, that this is in any way an easy life. It's a difficult life there. Things are hard, and the sort of the organizational challenges are apparent, I think, from the outset. And I think but that then for me is sort of precisely why it's interesting to engage with the movement. And so you said where, I suppose, kind of where does that misunderstanding come from? And I suppose something to me that's interesting about Rojava is that also it manages to, everyone has a reason to criticize it, sort of on the left, sort of from a liberal perspective, it's not democratic enough. They don't have elections. From a communist perspective, they might be, they're portraying the anti-imperial alliance of Assad and Russia, but perhaps more so, they're sort of, these sort of milksop anarchists from an anarchist perspective are, well, there is still this top down, organizational culture, there's still dominance of the Kurdish political class. And perhaps, all of these criticisms, I think all of these criticisms have some grain of truth in them, but that's why I think it's interesting for me to understand what's going on there. And I think sometimes, sort of we perhaps have the idea of people in support of Rojava, have the idea that, just to mention these things is to betray the revolution. But I don't think that's true. I think on the contrary, sort of it's also a bit, they're fine, they're busy, and it doesn't matter to them so much necessarily what we're discussing about, what is that revolution between us. That's more about our learning process. And in those discussions that we're having between ourselves, I think for us, it's more beneficial to say openly, yes, there are many ways in which what's happening in Rojava diverts from Öcalan's original ideas. And, some of those people will probably be familiar with, the commune system, isn't working in the way that it's laid out in Öcalan's writing. The economy is primarily an oil economy. It's the cooperatives have not challenged the dominance of the market, and speak about those things. Also, of course, speak about what is working. Sort of somehow as it should. The massive gains being made for women. The way things are evolving. So, something that I work on a lot and I speak about in the book is how the political process is evolving, how they're trying to hear from different actors, not necessarily through the communes, but through different mechanisms, through public meetings, through working with different sectors of society in the region, with the economy that, there are cooperatives, they are working to some extent, but that's not really how the market works. Then there are, but they are taking steps to help people through, price controls, through subsidies. But that's in a different way to how it was perhaps originally conceptualized as a result of that situation. And I think, to understand all that ultimately and to discuss that does the revolution the credit of taking it seriously and not, as I say, not just treating it as this sort of interesting curio. Isn't that nice? They're doing that, but understanding this is a real world. This is the real world and real lives, and this is how things are working in practice. And by engaging with that. Ultimately, I think that's a more respectful way actually to approach the revolution than simply making it out to be something which it's not.
No, that's such a good point. And of course, anybody who spent time in Rojava would tell you that you're constantly challenged to offer stronger criticisms of what you're seeing around. There's very much a culture of critical thinking about interrogating what the shortcomings are and how to overcome them. So, one more question I would like to ask you as we kind of pass things off to the group as a whole is to just kind of open up this topic of hope. It's sort of a loaded word. It means a lot of different things to different people. Um, I really appreciate the framing of your book around this question. I've found in a lot of sort of left circles that sort of an aversion to the very concept of hope, sort of embracing of hopelessness is almost approached at times as it's almost valorized, as if it's a sort of like a courageous form of realism, that's just sort of like those of us who are honest, we recognize the dire reality of our situation, and to be hopeful in the face of that is to sort of be completely irrational. But I wonder if you see the Kurdish movement as sort of showing us a way in which hope can also be a choice, a commitment, as you put it in your words, right? I know in Rojava they talk about like revolutionary personality. It makes me think of this quote from Paulo Freire, which I
Mm,
brought with me. I wanted to just briefly read. He says, "Hopelessness is a form of silence, of denying the world and fleeing from it." And this makes me think of a sort of like revolutionary critique of this looking at hopelessness as sort of this brave realism and actually seeing it as something that can be a sort of abdication of responsibility
mm,
for revolutionaries that, in other words, limits the actual scope of possibilities when we sort of give into it. So I'm curious, any thoughts you have on this to kind of open
mm.
it up to the broader conversation? Any thoughts on this topic of hope?
I mean, in terms of, I think, this idea of hope as a responsibility, hope as a commitment, hope as a practice. yeah, is important. That it's not something which is something that must be done and has to be sort of fought for and organized for. And I think what I say in the book is it's like you have even and especially when you don't feel hopeful, that's when you have to hope, and that's kind of the idea that I'm trying to express. And so I think, yeah, sort of, I speak quite a lot in the book about the internal political culture of the union movements, not so much what it does or what it tries to do in society, but how do people who are in this movement get out of bed in the morning? How do they keep going when people around you are getting killed every day? How do you keep going? In some of the ways for that, and I mean, and one of the things I think is I speak about is sort of there is no in the sense there's like not so much opportunity for retreat for escape, I suppose, from your political commitments there. So if you're living as people do there, who are in the movement in a very communal way, you have sort of what they would call it in Shorshgaden Bistuchar, like 24/7 revolutionaries, right? That is a phrase that you will hear. And that from the moment you get up until the moment you get to sleep, you're in this sort of very immersed political culture, and you have responsibility to people that kind of can't be shirked. And that, I think, for example, like living life in that way, it has its challenges, of course, and so particularly if you come from the West, could feel quite restrictive. But I think a benefit of that is it keeps people going, even when perhaps they don't want to. And I saw cases, I think, of people who were psychologically having a very difficult time because of losses they'd had, Kurdish people, international people as well, but because of this structure, sort of kept them going, got them out of bed, and they weren't doing it because they wanted to in their heart, because they were hopeful, but because they felt responsible to those around them. And I say that I think that's a form of hope. I say in the book I speak about it's easier to hope for others than it is to hope for yourself. Maybe that's also linked to what I was speaking about in terms of the internationalist commitment a moment ago as well. That hope, I think, is something that is done, and and then I sort of speak about it also in terms of this as a like act of commitment, I suppose, and that it's sort of a moment of choice in one's life to say, yes, I'm going to keep living in this way. I'm going to devote my life to this cause, knowing that in the Kurdish case that I may well be killed, or knowing in general in all of our cases I may well not live to see the kind of society that I want to see live, but saying, okay, I'm part of this history, which dates back millennia of striving for that idea, for that vision, and that the sort of the thing that's hoped for is by definition that which can't easily be obtained, which has to be fought, which has to be struggled for. But then that's maybe something grand, but that plays out then in every day, and that's an everyday choice that we make in our how we relate to one another. And I then sort of speak in the book a little bit more about what are ways that we might on a smaller scale begin implementing that kind of daily commitment to one another. How did the Kurdish people in the Kurdish movement begin doing that when they began, on a similarly small scale, 47 years ago, and begin building from that.
Absolutely. I think we'll go ahead and open it up now. The first question I see is from Sanan, and I'll just go ahead and read it out. Hope is contagious and wants to transcend borders, but it has to reside in human bodies, souls, subjectivities, constrained by structures, reactionary power, even status quo liberals. How is the Rojava Revolution transmitting that hope within Rojava, Syria, and internationally? What does this project of hope mean for the left, defined broadly in the West? What are the, quote, nodes where they and we can engage in the struggle, knowledge, organizing, and hope?
Mm. It's a good question, and these limitations on hope, are certainly present, I think. I mean, I think in the Syrian context right now, like I think we're seeing the challenges, I think, of spreading these ideas. These, I think, sort of as I speak about it in the book, then the sort of the ideas of the Kurdish movement were perhaps familiar to some people in the Kurdish community, not to other people in northern Syria. at the beginning of the revolution. And it was more through their practice. Again, it wasn't just through these ideas that they exist on paper. It was through these ideas meaning things to people in their daily lives that they were winning the support that they have won. So, women were seeing what they could gain from, the freedoms they could gain from working and living with this movement. For example, Kurdish people were seeing that the rights that they could have that they'd long been denied. And then, more broadly, I think, sort of where people, in the region as a whole have come to that movement. Yeah, it's been, it's been something, more pragmatic, perhaps, less about these ideas on paper and more about this is a movement which is willing to hear us, which is willing to let us express like our perspectives, which is willing to adapt itself to the realities in our regions, and which can provide security, which can provide bread, which can provide power, these very basic things. And that has been the sort of the contract, I suppose, on which these ideas have been spread. I think now on the Syrian level as a whole, the sort of insofar as there is a hopeful mood, that mood is coming from Damascus, and that mood is coming from the fall of Assad. That is my impression based on my time in the region. I was back in Syria in January, and the conversations that I have with Syrians, and I think it's challenging now, to see sort of how some of these ideas can be spread directly spread throughout Syria. I think there is certainly also a political effect, in terms of the ideas, particularly as you said, of respect for women's rights, respect for minority rights, that has been forced throughout the revolution in Rojava, and which is now having to be taken seriously, even though they would rather not, perhaps, by some people in Damascus. And that is a sort of a concrete outcome of the revolutionary gains there. But that's sort of, I suppose, more concretely. And then I think, the question is also about how does this idea of hope spread, right? And we spoke about, sort of the idea of the romanticization, I suppose, of the revolution, that can serve an idea. And it's, people know, now in anarchist circles, right, people will speak about Rojava and Zapatistas, and these are sort of proof that things are possible. But I think there is then that hope is sort of not as profound, I think, as the hope that can come from a sort of deeper understanding of this process. And so in terms of like linking, I think, sort of greater international interest in what's happening in Rojava is very important, not only in terms of supporting, defending it, but also in terms of understanding how these ideas work on the ground and getting a sense of that to the world, and saying to people, yes, this thing is still there, yes, it's happening, and let's engage with it, let's follow it, let's understand what's happening. I think that that organizational model, which I think is still little understood by many people on the left, has a great deal to offer. And I think, for people who are in this conversation, that's part of what I hope we are sort of doing when we engage with the revolution, is putting it into relationship with with other struggles, and then maybe seeing also where we can then see similar hybrid models developing around us, where we can see similar examples of links between, so sort of, for example, looking at South America and what's the relationship like between some of the more progressive governments there and the more grassroots networks there, who are working more from the basis of indigenous rights, feminist activism. How do they link to these state level governments? What are the challenges of that? What are the cases where it hasn't worked, but also what are the cases they have been able to work together? How does that work in Chile, for example? How does that work with the new government in Mexico? And I think, sort of thinking in that way about the relationship between between all these approaches, and then looking around us for examples of that, maybe home in the United States as well, I think is an important step to take in terms of understanding what this revolution means.
Thank you, Matt. I'm realizing that not only do we have a question from Haval Sinam Mohammed of the Syrian Democratic Council, but she's joining us here. And Sinam, if you're here, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'll give you just a moment to respond. If you would rather say your question, ask your question yourself, or if you'd like me to read it out. I'll take silence as I should read it out. But to Bekher Hati Haval Sinam, welcome.
Hello, thank you everyone. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can
Oh,
hear you.
Yes,
Thank
oh.
you for
yes.
joining.
Thank you so much for the organizer, for Matt, for everyone here. Really, it's important to know something about Rojava. And the people who lived in Rojava, I think they know more about it. That is the issue. We want everyone here to know about what's going on in Rojava. Actually, the organizing, the society, the committees, the institution, how it works. How could the people there in northeast Syria, in Rojava, as a Kurd and Arabs, Syrian Christians, multi-ethnic, multi-religions, people, how could they come together in this political and very difficult situation in Syria, whereas there is the fighting, sectarian fighting among others people. How could Rojava succeeded in making all this a coexistence in the northeast Syria work together? I know there will be some, difficulties, there will be some mistakes sometimes in the administration. That is very understandable. We understand. But how can, I would like to ask Matt, he was there. What do you think? How could the people come together and work together and being in the institution, especially the women, all the committees led by women, all these issues, how can we keep it? First of all, how can we keep all this model, unique model in Syria to work for all over Syria? And the other thing, how it happened, as you are in Rojava, you were in Rojava, so you know how well. So how it happened, how could these people, even there is a lot of differences between them, like cultures, like religions, the Arabs, the Kurds, the Syriac Christians, the Armenian. There is a lot of differences, but even though they could come together, they could build institution, they could
Mm.
build the general council like a parliament together. So that means it works. It works. So, first of all, how it happened, and second, how can we keep it after the HTS come and control the Damascus, and now a new government is in Damascus
Mm.
after the fall of Al-Assad. Whatever we are seeing now in the other region or the other part of Syria, how the
Mm.
Alawites have been killed, how the Druze have been killed, how is the attack against the Christians in Syria, in the bombing the church in Damascus. All this happened, in Syria within this government, in the new government or the interim government, transitional government in Syria. Whereas in the northeast Syria, the opposite is going on. So how it happened
Mm.
this way? Syria is a mosaic. Syria is the same. What is in the northeast Syria, it's in all over Syria. So we have like Christians, the Arab, the Kurd. In Damascus, we have Kurds. In Aleppo, we have Kurds. We have Arabs, we have Syriac Christians, Alawite. So this is really a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious Syria. This is what we need. How can we solve this problem now?
Mm.
And even the Damascus
Yeah.
now, they are rejecting any decentralized system. They are rejecting any decentralized, like a federalism or decentralized system in northeast Syria. And thank you so much, Matt. Thank you so. I'm very eager to hear from you. And thank you for everyone attending here and hearing me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sinam. We really appreciate you being here. Just really quickly, so in case folks don't know, Sinam Mohammed serves as basically like an ambassador of Rojava's autonomous administration here in the United States as a formal representative of the Syrian Democratic Council's U.S. mission. So we're really lucky to have her join today. Sinam Desete Sagbe. Matt, any thoughts on what Sinam was asking?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for joining, Sinam. Always good to see you, and I know you were busy, so I'm glad you could make it. Yeah, certainly. So I think, yeah, maybe I will speak more, yeah, sort of about this, yeah, this second part of, yeah, sort of what's happening now and how to go forward from what's been achieved and the lessons from Rojava in the past like 14 years. Like as I said, in general, my observations in the northeast were that where things worked and where they were taken up, it was because people felt a need for them and they felt a need for these ideas. It wasn't about so much, I think, about the act of going, although this did also happen, of consciously going and, sort of trying to hold seminars in Raqqa, this former ISIS capital, and explain these things to people. It was more about the practical need of communities to live together, to survive, to find ways not to continue the conflict, to model this mutual understanding because people were tired of killing, because they needed an alternative, because they needed, to survive and to live next to one another. And those, I think, are the lessons that are very important now to take forward to Syria as a whole. And I think they must go. Those lessons, I think, for me, are very important. They must go be advanced. As it's not just, yeah, as I suppose a practical necessity, maybe as Sinan was suggesting, on the Syrian level as a whole. That the question in Syria now is, how can we go on from, after these 14 years of killing? There's a lot of young men in this country, sadly, that took up arms as as children, as teenagers, and all they know is killing. That's all that's been around them, killing and the crimes that come with war. How do you go from that situation to rebuild the country? And I think saying then, we have this model in the northeast that is functional, that works. It's not perfect, but it has been the most functional alternative by a long way to Assad this whole time, and we believe this can, this has something to offer the rest of Syria, is very important. I think in bringing that lesson, I think the sort of, especially this question of the relations between the Sunni Arabs, who are the majority in Syria, and all those other minority communities that Sinan mentioned, are very important. And I think that then it can't. I think there's a danger in saying, these ideas are important because they protect minorities alone, and that of course is important. The protection of the Christians in the northeast, of the Yazidis, sure offers lessons for protecting these other minority communities, the Druze, and the Alawites. But I think we also have to say these are things which are beneficial for everyone in Syria, and that includes the, the 70% who are Sunni Arabs, that they also have their own interests that are different from city to city. They also were marginalized and maltreated by the central authorities. They also have an interest in having their voices heard. Half of them are also women, of course. And so, not, I suppose, taking this, this model as though it's just about protecting these minorities from Damascus, but saying this is a way we can all work together. All our cities can have a say in their own future. I think is trying to bring all of Syria, including the Sunni Arab majority, on board is very important, particularly in this post conflict situation. And I think
Hey Matt, can you hear me
again,
okay?
it's that to be sort of demonstrated through practice. Like, so when I was in, I was in Raqqa in January after the fall of Assad, and I was, of course, I was speaking to people and saying, "Hey, what do you want?" And what most people were saying was, the sort of the Kurdish-led project in the northeast was that was the best thing for us. They saved us from ISIS. There have been some issues, but it's broadly been the best thing. But now, what do we want? We want a reintegration. We want a normal life. We want a passport that works. We want a unified country.
Hey Matt, if you can hear me, I think we're just gonna pause and ask if there's anything you could do on your end to try to solve the internet connection. I know you're dealing with some technological constraints on your end, and it's good timing because I know Debbie Bookchin had some thoughts to offer right now, also in reaction to Sinam's question. So Debbie, I think it'd be great we could turn to you briefly and circle back to Matt and see if the tech issues are a little better.
That sounds great. Thanks. And maybe, yeah, maybe Matt wants to even try hanging up and reconnecting. Sometimes that helps. And thanks for the opportunity. I think that Matt's answer was so important and Sinam's question was so important. And I just wanted to add one brief thought to her question, which I think also speaks to another question that was in the chat by Joe, asking about how and why assemblies are embedded in Kurdish culture prior to the revolution. And what I'm thinking, is that another important aspect of why I think the revolution was so successful, in Sinam's words, in terms of integrating sort of all the people, different men, women, many ethnicities, was what I experienced when I was in Rojava that was so extraordinary and that was so different from the kind of organizing that has gone on traditionally here in the West, although I think that's starting to change now, is that the level of the emphasis on education. And you see that both in the foregrounding, in the years and years prior to the Rojava Revolution, in which there was just this extensive, these assemblies, sort of all the kind of subterranean organizing that went on in a very, very meticulous way. So, sort of really, which speaks to the issue of sort of being ready for when a door opens for a possibility of challenging the existing power structures. All that groundwork had been done so meticulously in Syria, and of course also in the southeast of Turkey, in Bakur, for years and years in advance. So it really underscores the importance of education. But the other thing that I saw that was so fascinating to me, and here, I mean, I really kind of credit the women's movement in Rojava for this, is just the face-to-face educational possibilities, that what happens when what I saw when I was there is the women's movement going literally door to door, house by house, village by village, talking to people, talking to women, but also, because there are many ethnicities, in the northeast of Syria, talking to women who are not only Kurdish, but women who were, Syrian women who were from all walks of life, Yazidi women, just all sort of this kind of face-to-face kind of interaction that I think we're starting to see a little bit more now under the sort of communalist model, which is that people really need to get to know each other. They need to know their neighbors. They need to meet together in person. And this it goes a long way in terms of overcoming these sort of built-in ethnic divides that people sometimes grow up having. So I think that in that respect, and I don't want to take any more time, the Rojava model really has something to teach us, which is that this kind of, like, both whether you call it assembly democracy of people meeting face to face in assemblies, or even just the educational project of going out into neighborhoods, meeting neighbors, bringing people together, talking on that one-to-one kind of basis, that there's really no substitute for it. And it's one of the most really exceptional things that I saw when I was in Rojava. And I saw it at work in the Malajin, the women's houses, where people were able to help resolve disputes, and not only among Kurdish people, but among all the other various ethnicities. People came and participated. So anyway, I don't want to take any more time, but I just wanted to add that to Matt's excellent answer. Thank you.
Yeah. Can people hear me again?
That sounds great, Matt. We were just gonna
Yeah.
check.
Yeah. 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 I mean, yeah, I would just briefly echo what Debbie said. And it's something that you see, when you arrive there, is that this revolution didn't just begin out of nowhere in 2011, but there have been decades of work before that, both in terms of introducing these ideas, sharing them, also in terms of building up this sense of trust that, even before this revolution took place, this movement was already trusted to mediate in community disputes. It was trusted to protect women who were facing domestic violence. It was trusted essentially to do what the state was failing to do. And I think you then see that, and that of course was particularly in the Kurdish areas, and that was why that provided the base, for the revolution to then be successful and to not get swept away by, on a military level or on a political level. And of course, then what you then see now is with the attempts to introduce these in other areas where there weren't those deep roots before, the challenges of that and the challenges of coming to someone and saying, hey, we have these ideas. And then you have to begin with that learning process. And, that I think is the process that's kind of ongoing now, like in Northeast Syria, is that process of understanding these other communities that are different and have different priorities as any community does, and understanding what do they need, and is that something that can be provided to them. And those are things I think that are doable at scale, and that are doable in different ways in different contexts. So I would agree with that.
Thanks so much, Matt. We're going to do our best to get to as many questions as we can, but apologies if we don't get to everybody's questions. There's one jumping out at me right now, which seems like a good what this conversation is a great bridge towards, which is about assemblies. The question is from Joe Taylor, and it is, could you speak about how and why assemblies were embedded in Kurdish culture prior to the revolution? Or I suppose as a question, if they were. Um, and he adds, I suspect it's assemblies or fascism when the shit hits the fan. Any thoughts on this, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I think, so obviously, I suppose in terms of, sort of prior, I suppose, to the ideas of the Kurdish movement becoming disseminated. I think there was the sort of Kurdish culture, like looking back over the centuries, has been defined by a resistance to the centralized state, but not often in a very progressive form. So a resistance to the centralized state, but that has been done, sort of typically in terms of, sort of the power of patriarchal tribal structures that are themselves obviously, top-down structures but that are resistant to central state authority, to put it in sort of crude terms. And so I think that historic experience shows that just because something is outside the state doesn't mean it's good, and that that any structure, even if it's self-organized, it can fall prey to these same things. And it's not just about doing something outside the state, but it's also making that something that's truly inclusive. In order to undertake that project, of course, the Öcalan has engaged, as people here know, in this, I suppose, long-term historic project of looking for examples, particularly in Kurdish culture and in that region, of more communal ideas, of more matriarchal modes of social organization, and using that to inform his contemporary political vision. And I think sort of what I say in my book, I think, because of for me at least, sort of the relevance of that process, and particularly as Öcalan approaches it, is giving Kurdish people a sense of something that to them, I think, historically, of course, has been, essentially has been experienced as a negative, as a sort of exposure. The fact there's been no Kurdish state, the fact that they've been exposed to these attacks, the fact also of this sort of tribalism, patriarchal tribalism in Kurdish culture, saying, well, actually, can we think about that in a way that is not that actually we can make something positive of that? The fact of this exclusion from the state becomes something, becomes a strength. And I think that process in Öcalan's work is very much about creating a sense of history for the Kurdish people, that allows them to feel a sense of value and ownership and engagement in these ideas, that to be Kurdish in some ways to be open to this alternative way of political organization, that to be Kurdish in some way is to be suspicious of male authority and so on. And I think that is and that has allowed these ideas to develop the traction that they have developed within the Kurdish movement. And I think, then briefly, that it's also an important task, right? In all of our own. And I think actually for me, it's a very interesting question of how do you do that in the contemporary United States? And I think something I saw a lot from other international people in Kurdistan, particularly from Britain, from America, from Germany, these kind of countries, was a tendency to say, oh, it's all hopeless. I'm from America. It's a fascist country. It's an imperialist country. There's nothing good there. But that is, I think, that's not the answer, and the Kurdish comrades sort of wouldn't accept that. Say, if you're from Turkey, you have to say, okay, what are from your region of Turkey, what are the examples of historic cooperation, and what are the things that are happening now that are positive and that can be built on, and wherever you are, whether you're in, some sort of small town or whether you're, in an inner city area, there are always ways in which people have worked together, historically, and that's important to understand. Also, that we see looking around us, and I think being able to look back and understand what are the sort of the positive things. I don't know, for example, about I mean, you know better than me, but for example, the experience of immigrants arriving in your city in America, and how did they survive? What were their coping mechanisms? What's happening today? Working along with that rather than trying to create something out of nothing and hand it over to people, I think is a very important part of political organization. And maybe that's just because I'm a history nerd, but I do believe, as the Kurdish movement does, that understanding history and finding what is positive and can be organized upon and built upon in a personal or a national history is very important as a precursor to organization.
I think this is a great bridge to the next question, which is one about the role of culture. It's a question from Scott, which reads, I believe and understand that many communities across this revolution are finding new senses of identity and solace by having newfound liberties to embrace their cultural heritage. I wonder, though, if communities are utilizing cultural heritage as tools for their radical, forward-looking imaginations and practice. Are there instances where songs, rituals, artistic expressions influence long-term goals as well as day-to-day work of maybe workers, cooperatives, agricultural practices, or even architectural design? Thoughts on culture?
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. It's very important. I mean, I think, as you sort of suggest, I think the main a sort of cultural approach of the revolution. I mean, there are a couple of things. Maybe the main thing, is this attempt to, I suppose, create or recreate and strengthen and deepen, a sense of Kurdish political identity, particularly. Then also for these other minority communities, to sort of go back and find so whatever it might be, Syriac music, Armenian forms of art, and use those. And that kind of folkloric approach is important, as you said, and that's I think about creating this the sense of cultural identity, but then also finding things in that which support this narrative of Sinan said Syria as a mosaic. And so, for example, even in a city like Manbij, it's like an Arab city, they would sort of speak about that city as this city of, it's been a city of cosmopolitan culture since time immemorial, and there are sort of figures from the mythology around that city that they would use to promote that idea. So I think it's a process of, on the one hand, it's just about, sort of allowing people access to their own identity and their own culture, but it's also trying to use that to form the basis of this broader civic identity. I think it's a kind of challenging process because it can then, there's, as you can see, there's a kind of tension here, right? Particularly in terms of the Kurdish identity, because it's sort of about saying we have this identity which is about multiculturalism, which is about cosmopolitanism, which is about allowing that has a particular respect for women's autonomy. What is that? It's a Kurdish culture, and that then can become a kind of more nationalist project, right? That there is something particularly good about this Kurdish culture, and as opposed to other cultures. So it's a difficult sort of balance, kind of balancing act, I suppose, between revitalizing these things and advancing it, but doing it in a way which creates I suppose, a positive narrative. And I think, also for a lot of people, it's something more simply, people experience what's happening in the Northeast as a sort of Kurdish nationalist project, and they feel invested in it because they're Kurdish. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for them. It's sort of people's right. But that then can create issues with these other communities that are living there, who feel like, okay, well, actually, this is a Kurdish project. It's not just for me. So that whole kind of process is very challenging. Those, I suppose those are some of the ways. Yeah, I could speak more detail about the different sort of bits of culture that are coming out. I think the stuff. Yeah, if you people are interested in seeing culture being produced in the Northeast, then the films from the Rojava Film Commune are some of the best sort of entry points, I think, to see a bit of how do people perceive themselves, for example, and it's interesting new culture that's being produced. And there's some good music as well.
And of course, the fact that every community and even every commune includes the Chandu Huner, the culture and arts sort of structure, comes to mind as a sign of the importance of culture in the movement as well. The next question is from Azad, and it is taking things in the direction of metaphysics. When you wrote the book about how the revolution held on to hope, did you ever connect it to the metaphysics of Öcalan's ideology? I hear a lot of people talk about the systemic and cultural aspects of the revolution, but I never hear people discuss Öcalan's metaphysics about how he attributes meaning to existence. He said at times throughout his work that all life exists for freedom and lives with this perfect purpose. If I also recall, he also cited Spinoza's ideas of existence in progressive intelligence. Did you see this lived
Mm.
out in your own observations of life in Rojava?
In a sense. So, I mean, in the book, as I say, I speak about sort of the more existential question of what is hope, how do we hope, where do we find it, and I think with that sort of what Öcalan sort of sets out, what I was saying about how he sets out to find this sense of inherent freedom and autonomy in Kurdish political identity, that he goes further than that, right? He sort of tries to demonstrate that all of all of kind of human existence, or all of nature, even is sort of building up to creating these kind of projects in autonomy and true freedom. And I think again for me, the sort of it's that project. It's similar, for example, to what Karl Marx sets out to do, to show that all of human history is building up to this final confrontation of, in his case, the worker and the worker and the capitalist, and that is sort of somehow metaphysically will lead up to this inevitable final confrontation. And that, I think, is the point of it, is to create this stage, this sort of cosmic battle, which is then, in his case, localized in Kurdistan and localized around this revolution. And I think, it's an attempt to, sort of understand all of history in that way. It's an act of that to me is an act of hope against hope. It's an act of choosing to look at the universe and say, yes, I believe when I see the world around it, I see the universe, I see it all leading up to this project, and that's a sort of an act of faith, right? In the book, in my book, I don't speak about Spinoza, but I do speak about a thinker called Ernst Bloch, who's kind of an aside. But if you're interested in these questions, he's sort of crazy German mystical Marxist who's understood Marxism in similar ways, in this quite like almost ontological way of sort of, it is the straining of all of history and all of civilization towards becoming what it is not. And so I think these ideas sort of can sound quite abstract. I think for me, sort of the concrete meaning of them and how I would see that reflected around me in the Northeast is through this kind of commitment that people had in the middle of the horrors of the war, that people chose to believe that they were on the front of something huge, and they could feel that they felt like and they were on living through historical times. And that gave people, I think, a sense, of dignity, as a word that I've mentioned a couple of times today. And I think that's very important, a sense that they're part of something which is, has historical consequences. And I think, that was, of course, was also the case with Marxism. I think Öcalan has managed to give that sense to the Kurdish people. I think that's a very hard thing to do, but I think ultimately, in terms of revolutionary change, that's a sense that, we all need to find. And in the book, maybe I think I speak about, okay, where can this sort of, that sense of gravitas come from? And I think for me, an important part of the answer is the climate crisis. I think that is something which, it's a global crisis which demands a global response. Which comes with a, I speak in the book about sort of the climate crisis as an apocalypse, and how I speak about how do political movements respond to apocalypse. I speak about the Syrian war as this sort of existential all or nothing situation for the Kurdish people, which therefore created room for them to launch these bold ideas. And I then say, okay, maybe it's through climate organization and through the urgent need to find a truly systemic alternative that we ourselves might feel that same sense, that we might look at history in the same way, the history of our country or our world in the same way as leading up to this epochal point, and that might then begin to have an impact on the way that we act and organize day to day, as it did for people in north and east Syria who were on the front line of their own local but very real apocalypse.
I think we have time for a couple more, and I'm going to go next to a question from Afia. Question is, what can modern American and or Western leftists learn from Kurdish revolutionary organizing? I am in the DSA and struggle with sexism, so I can personally relate. Also, what shortcomings does Rojava have with gender? So sort of positive and negative lessons of gender in the Kurdish movement?
Well, I probably, apologies, but I will have to make this one the last question because I have to get away quite close to the hour, if that's okay. But
That's perfect. Thank you.
and if there are more questions, people can reach out to me.
Perfect.
You can ask for my email or find my socials. I think to sort of conclude, I think it's an important question about sort of the internal approach to sexism within the movement. Yeah, of course, the Kurdish movement has a strong women's movement, but why do they have a strong women's movement? It's because women have a hard time in Kurdish society, and they have had historically and have to this day challenges and difficulties internally within the movement as well. Of course, so we speak about Kurdish society as in some sense, there has been this role for women in Kurdish society, but that doesn't change the fact that, like any society, it's a deeply patriarchal society. In this case, Kurdish society is a conservative, like Sunni Muslim primarily society, where women are married off young, where women stay at home, where women don't work, where honor killing is commonplace, domestic violence is commonplace. Those are all things that were true in Rojava at the outbreak of the revolution, are still true to some extent in many communities there. And within the movement, women are constantly fighting against the internal not being taken seriously, instances, of course, of abuse. All of these things, it's not like they don't happen at all. In the Northeast, they do, and I saw that myself. But what is of course is striking is that they are taken very seriously in this movement, more so than any other movement I've ever come into contact with or that I believe exists. Puts women to the forefront of dealing with these things, of making women's voices heard, of respecting their right to be alone as women, and to organise responses to these as women. And I guess sort of a consequence of that. I mean, there's a lot to be said. One thing is that men are kind of scared of the women a little bit, and I think that's a good thing. That women have a real power. Within this movement, and that's a sort of power shift, and they know that, and you can feel that, in interactions with them, that because they have these autonomous women's structures, as people know, they have the confidence, I think, to when something happens, it can be addressed and can be focused on and can be dealt with, and that men therefore often feel that they are accountable, and that they can't just get away with stuff, that they will be called out on, whether it's small little behaviors, whether it's something more serious and more structural, that there is a kind of a constant process of calling to account, and which works and which comes with material consequences, sort of in terms of that person's place within the movement, for example. So it's kind of acted upon and it's taken seriously, and it's not something which is after the fact, but it's something which is which is sort of instructional. And maybe this sort of, I think what is important is that because this role for this place for women's autonomy is so fundamental, it's sort of it's something that's agreed upon between everyone, right? It's not that people have, or in theory at least, it's not that people have different ideas of what is feminism, what kind of feminist am I. It's like there is one sort of, I suppose, agreed upon set of principles that are quite concrete about how a man can and can't act with a woman, to the extent, okay, a man can't be alone, in a room with a woman even, within the movement. this is how a man should sit when a woman's around, even on that level, right? And that the fact there are these agreed set on principles that all stem from a shared understanding of the importance of women's autonomy mean that there can be a bit less. It's less a question of, oh, did this happen? Didn't happen? What do we think about that? How are we going to deal with that? Because there is a shared political culture that is shared between everyone in that movement, and that makes it easier to say, okay, well, that's just not going to happen because we all know, yeah, this is how we do it, and this is how we organize. And I don't think that political culture would be the same, or can ever be the same in somewhere like North America as it can be in northern Syria. But it's more the idea of having a shared culture and a culture which everyone understands and everyone agrees in and everyone is committed to. That then means you are able to deal more effectively with issues like those that you sadly mentioned that you've been facing. So I mean, yeah, those are some of the things. There's of course also other good. If you're interested in these ideas, I'd recommend, for example, Dilar Dörek's book on the Kurdish women's movement, where she speaks in a lot more depth about that movement, especially, and which is many books worth of study in itself. But it's that's all I can say on that.
Matt, thank you so much, not just for that answer, but for taking the time to be here today, for all the great work you've done in Northeast Syria, and of course for your fantastic book, Hope Without Hope. Really hope you have a good rest of your day, um, and safe travels and everything that you're doing with your life and work.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, I really do appreciate it. And these were it was a great set of questions, and there were other very interesting questions in the chat. Of course. Yeah, feel free to get in touch with me if you have further questions, and I'd be very happy to discuss. And yeah, thanks also to it was great to see you, Debbie, and Sinam, and Arthur as well. And for making these conversations happen. I think they're very important. And so thank you all for coming and for keeping up this. I can tell also from the questions, the serious critical conversation around the Northeast. Hi Penny. It's very important. So we'll keep on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much again. All the best to you. Slav.
No.
And
Thank you
for
very much.
everybody,
Take care.
thank you so much. Take it easy, Matt. And for everybody else, we really appreciate you taking the time to attend today's event. As we said, we did hope to get to as many questions as we could. As Matt logs off, I took just a couple uh, notes on some questions that we didn't have the chance to get to and could offer just some passing comments. For example, Jorg, I apologize if I mispronounce your name, raised this question around cooperatives and the cooperative economy. What is the status of that in Northeast Syria? How does it work? And while we don't have a chance here to sort of get into it in details, I think it's in broad strokes something we can understand as the movement is attempting to create what they call a social economy as a kind of parallel cooperative based economy that really exists in practice alongside a sort of capitalist market economy like everywhere else. I would say the cooperative economy in Northeast Syria is still sort of marginal. It's competing very much in terms of legitimacy, I would say, more than in terms of like hard economic power. But of course, the circumstances are very difficult. But yes, you see in Northeast Syria, workers' cooperatives and other creative forms of cooperatives throughout society, throughout the economy, and things from agriculture to, small shops and restaurants to food production and manufacturing, and other things. You also have parallel forms of this social economy that are not just about sort of cooperative enterprises, but no, like in the village and neighborhood communes, for example, people can access free or subsidized basic goods, things like bread, things like cooking oil. Some of that changes from community to community, but more or less, there's this effort to basically build a new economy within the shell of the old, you could say. And it has a lot of shortcomings and contradictions, but it is a very sincere effort, and you can see elements of it everywhere. Um, the other question I'd like to touch on, um, because it was really great, was I think it was from Paul, was just about how is the movement struggling to balance, on the one hand, the need to secure uh, the desire to secure the sort of political, social gains of the revolution itself, with, on the other hand, the very concrete need to secure the basic survival of the region, of the movement, of its structures, of its communities. And I don't so much think that I have like an answer to that question, so much as I really want to just highlight that that's just it, right? That it is a balance, and this is part of how we, I think, can understand the challenges of a real living, breathing social revolution at the scale of an entire region involving millions of people and entire communities. Is that, I think there's a constant tension between, one way to put it is like transformation and survival. But boy, howdy, if anything, I think the Kurdish freedom movement shows us an incredible example of a movement that takes a pragmatic approach. I think there's this quote from General Muslim Kobani, the general commander of the SDF, of course, who once said, when he was asked about these sort of messy contradictions of uh, kind of having a temporary truce with the regime soldiers on the northern border during a Turkish invasion. And he said something like, if given the choice between compromise and genocide, we will choose the life of our people every time. So I think that's the best. I can't put it a better way than Muslim Kobani. Um, it's time, I think, to sort of round out the event. That was a fantastic presentation by Matt, and really appreciated all the very engaging questions that everybody had to offer. Grateful to have Sinam join us today and Debbie Bookchin as well to offer their own thoughts. But before we close out the event, I want to just circle back to, yes, of course, ECR's end of year fundraiser. I want to give it one more plug for everybody, and not just encourage everybody to support our fundraiser, but to support our work, to check it out, to go ahead and get on to defendrojava.org. If you're not already signed up for our newsletter, you can do so here. There's a link in the chat now. If you're not already following us on social media, on Blue Sky and Twitter, we have accounts. We really encourage people to follow our new Instagram account, which we're trying to build up. We really appreciate more follows and boosts there. But yes, we're having our end of year fundraising drive, and we really appreciate anything you can do to chip in if you can. I know it's tough out there, and it's a time of year where everybody's being as generous as they can in as many different directions as possible. But we really do believe that it's really important that Rojava does not stand alone, and that in a place like the United States, the sort of belly of the beast, as they say, the most powerful nation state in the world, a nation state that has enormous influence over what happens in a place like Syria. It's incredibly important that our voices are heard here in the United States, um, that we have a visible and vocal movement supporting the Kurdish freedom movement, supporting the diverse communities of Northeast Syria, pushing for policies that will help secure their survival, again, in a very pragmatic way, but also pushing movements here to support the transformation side of the tension we were just talking about, right? And ultimately they're inseparable, right? If we want to be able to see Rojava live and continue to develop and flourish as a movement that, transformative movements around the world, including in the United States, can take inspiration from, can learn critical strategic lessons from, it needs to survive. And if it's going to survive, it's going to do so with broad international attention and support. So for those of us based here in the US, or even our friends calling in from abroad, we really encourage you to stay involved with the Emergency Committee for Rojava one way or another, to follow the work that we do. We put out statements on events and press releases. We give public talks in person, traveling around to various sort of progressive movement gatherings and conferences. We sometimes do speaking tours and special events. Of course, we do online info sessions. We're also working to build bridges with other movement organizations, to build relationships between movements and organizations in Northeast Syria and organizations here in the United States. If you're somebody who's politically active in progressive movements in the United States and you want to build those relationships and bridges, we encourage you to reach out to us about these things. No, and we're trying to also spread education through other creative means, which is another way you can get involved. If you've got graphic design skills, if you're an artist, if you have a podcast, if you write articles and op-eds, for example, get in touch with us. Let's find creative ways that we can work together to spread support and awareness of the Kurdish freedom movement. Um, Lastly, when it comes to our end of the year fundraiser, as we mentioned earlier, we do have a bunch of special gifts. So if you're looking for stocking stuffers, or more realistically, we will be shipping our gifts early in the new year. We're still a scrappy grassroots organization, so it's just kind of volunteers making these things happen. But just to kind of give you a taste, you can follow the link in the chat. But we have at sort of sliding scales depending on the level of contribution you're able to make. We do have a variety of gifts that we're giving. So, at one level, we offer the gift of a book called The Political Thought of Abdullah Öcalan. That's an incredible collection of 4 or 5 key essays that really serve as kind of foundational texts of the Kurdish freedom movement and of the Rojava Revolution, the sort of key writings of philosophy and political ideology that really inform kind of what you see in practice being built on the ground. Um, at a higher level of donation, we offer folks a choice between a variety of great books, one being the book that Matt just mentioned, Dilar Dirik's The Kurdish Women's Movement, another being Practicing Social Ecology by Eleanor Finley, and of course, this year we've just ordered a giant box of copies of Matt's incredible book, Hope Without Hope. So if you don't have a copy of that yet, or if you want to pick one up for your friends or comrades, that's also an option. And then lastly, we have a very limited supply, but a real supply nonetheless, of a variety of sizes of some incredible handmade, hand-printed Defend Rojava t-shirts that a group of ECR volunteers graciously made for us. And if you make a very, very generous donation, we even have a sort of combo pack where we're going to just put one of each together as long as supplies last and send you a big thank you in the mail. So, of course, it's not all transactional, but we do just want to show our gratitude to all of you one way or another, and in doing so, kind of spread the good word, so to speak. So, thank you all so much for attending today's event, for considering making a contribution to ECR's end of year fundraising drive. And lastly, we would be incredibly grateful if you would also spread the word about our end of the year fundraiser. If you have the ability to share it in a group chat you're in, share it with your local friends or family or colleagues, share it on social media. It's very much appreciated. It helps us reach more people. And it will help us carry out the work that we want to carry out next year. We have very ambitious plans as usual to kind of grow this movement, continue to develop it, to build new relationships, to get out and travel and give these talks in different communities. But making that possible will require resources, of course. So thank you all so much. Love and solidarity to you all this holiday season, whatever that looks like for you. Um, and as they say in the movement, Slavurez. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.